The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time. At 28 years old, he had served as a Queen's Guard for 6 years, but today felt different somehow. The weight of his bearskin hat seemed heavier, and the familiar routine of changing guard duty carried an unusual tension in the air. James had grown up in a small village outside London, where his grandmother Martha had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was just 7 years old. Martha was a devout woman who attended church every Sunday without fail, and she had given James a small silver cross on his 18th birthday before he left for military training. "This belonged to your grandfather during the war," she had told him with tears in her eyes. "It kept him safe through the darkest times, and now it will watch over you." The cross had become James's most treasured possession. He wore it every day beneath his uniform, close to his heart, and often touched it during difficult moments. It reminded him not only of his grandmother's love, but also of the grandfather he had never met, a man who had shown extraordinary courage during World War II, earning 3 medals for bravery while serving in the Royal Navy. As James took his position at the castle gate, tourists were already beginning to gather. He could see families with children pointing excitedly at his uniform, cameras clicking away as visitors tried to capture the perfect photo. This was part of the job he had learned to accept, though it sometimes felt strange to be treated more like a statue than a person. The Queen's Guard were expected to remain completely still and silent, no matter what happened around them. The morning passed peacefully enough. James watched as tour groups came and went, guide voices echoing across the courtyard as they shared stories about the castle's 800-year history. Children tried to make him smile or move, their parents laughing as they encouraged the harmless game. James had developed the ability to focus his mind elsewhere during these long shifts, often thinking about his grandmother or planning his weekend visits to see her. Around midday, the crowd began to thicken as more tourists arrived for the afternoon tours. James noticed a man in his 30s standing near the gate, watching him intently. Unlike the other visitors who took their photos and moved on, this man seemed fixated, studying James as if he were trying to solve some kind of puzzle. There was something unsettling about his stare. It was too focused, too intense for a casual tourist. The man was dressed in a dark jacket and jeans, nothing particularly unusual, but his behavior set him apart. He kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, his hands fidgeting in his pockets. James had been trained to observe potential threats while maintaining his stoic pose, and every instinct told him this person was different from the hundreds of other visitors he encountered each day. As the minutes ticked by, the man moved closer to James's position. Other tourists continued their normal activities around them, taking selfies, reading guidebooks, chatting with family members, but this individual seemed disconnected from the casual atmosphere. His eyes never left James, and there was something almost predatory in his gaze that made the guard's skin crawl beneath his thick wool uniform. James tried to push the uncomfortable feeling aside, reminding himself that unusual behavior from tourists was not uncommon. Some people were simply more curious or persistent than others. Perhaps this man was a military enthusiast, fascinated by the traditions and history represented by the Queen's Guard. Maybe he was planning to join the military himself and was studying the uniform and bearing of the guards. But as the stranger took another step closer, James felt his grandmother's cross against his chest, and somehow knew that this day was going to test him in ways he had never experienced before. The peaceful morning routine was about to be shattered, and the lessons of courage and faith that Martha had taught him throughout his childhood were about to become more important than ever. The man's lips curved into what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. James maintained his position, eyes fixed straight ahead, but every muscle in his body tensed as he prepared for whatever was about to unfold in the courtyard of Windsor Castle. Without warning, the stranger lunged forward and grabbed the chain around James's neck, yanking hard enough to pull the silver cross from beneath his red tunic. The sudden attack caught everyone off guard. Tourists gasped and stepped backward, parents pulled their children closer, and several people began reaching for their phones to capture what they thought might be some kind of performance or demonstration. But James knew immediately that this was no act. The man's grip was fierce and desperate, his fingers digging into the delicate silver chain as he tried to rip it away completely. Years of military training kicked in, but James faced an impossible situation. As a Queen's Guard, he was bound by centuries of tradition and strict protocol. He could not move, speak, or break his position under any circumstances, no matter what provocation he faced. The stranger seemed to understand this and pressed his advantage. "Come on then," he sneered loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "What are you going to do about it, toy soldier? Just stand there like the useless decoration you are?" His words dripped with contempt as he continued pulling at the cross, the chain cutting into James's neck as the metal link strained under the pressure. James felt his heart racing, but not from fear, from pure rage. This cross represented everything sacred to him: his grandmother's love, his grandfather's courage, his faith, and his connection to family members who had shaped his character. The thought of some random stranger destroying something so precious made his blood boil, but he remained frozen in position, his face a mask of complete composure. The crowd was growing larger now, with some people clearly distressed by what they were witnessing. A few tourists called out, asking if someone should help or call security, but others seemed unsure whether this was part of some historical reenactment they didn't understand. The confusion worked in the attacker's favor, buying him precious seconds to continue his assault. "Look at this crowd," the man continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "They're all watching you get humiliated, and you can't do anything about it. What kind of man are you?" He gave another violent jerk to the chain, and James heard the faint sound of metal beginning to give way under the stress. Inside his mind, James was fighting a war between duty and instinct. Everything in his training told him to maintain discipline, to trust that security would intervene, to remember that his role as Queen's Guard was bigger than any personal attack. But every fiber of his being as a man, as a grandson, as someone who had learned to stand up for what mattered, screamed at him to fight back. The attacker seemed to sense this internal struggle and decided to escalate further. He leaned close to James's ear and whispered something vicious and personal, words that questioned not only James's courage, but also his worth as a human being. The insults were calculated and cruel, designed to break through the guard's legendary composure and force some kind of reaction. James closed his eyes for just a moment and thought of his grandmother Martha. He remembered her sitting in her small kitchen, teaching him about patience and strength, about how true courage sometimes meant enduring hardship without striking back. She had told him stories about his grandfather, who had once spent 3 days in freezing water after his ship was torpedoed, never giving up hope, never losing faith. When James opened his eyes again, something had changed. The rage was still there, burning hot in his chest, but it was now controlled and focused. He looked directly at his attacker for the first time, and what the man saw in those steady, unwavering eyes made him falter. This was not the reaction he had expected. Instead of breaking the guard's composure, his attack had somehow made James stronger. The crowd had gone completely silent now, sensing that something profound was happening. Children stopped fidgeting, adults held their breath, and even the attacker seemed momentarily uncertain about what to do next. The silver cross caught the afternoon sunlight as it hung partially torn from James's neck, swaying slightly in the gentle breeze that swept across the castle courtyard. What happened next would become the defining moment of James Mitchell's military career, and a story that would spread far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. Instead of breaking protocol or lashing out in anger, James did something completely unexpected. He began to speak, but not in the way anyone might have anticipated. His voice was calm, steady, and filled with a quiet authority that seemed to command the attention of everyone within hearing distance. "Sir," James said, his eyes never leaving the attacker's face, "I can see that you're in pain." The words were so gentle, so completely opposite to what the situation seemed to call for, that the man's grip on the cross loosened slightly. "Something has hurt you deeply, and you're trying to pass that hurt along to someone else." The attacker's expression shifted from aggressive confidence to confusion. This was not how he had expected a confrontation with a Queen's Guard to unfold. He had come here looking for a fight, expecting either silent submission or explosive anger. Instead, he was faced with something he had never encountered before: genuine compassion from someone he was actively trying to humiliate. James continued speaking, his voice carrying across the courtyard so that everyone could hear. "This cross you're holding belonged to my grandfather, a man I never got to meet. He wore it through World War II, through battles where he watched friends die, through nights when he thought he might not see another sunrise. But you know what kept him going? It wasn't the metal or the chain. It was the faith that even in the darkest moments there was still goodness in the world. The crowd was completely transfixed now. Phones that had been raised to record what looked like an assault were now capturing something entirely different, a masterclass in grace under pressure. Parents found themselves leaning in to make sure their children could hear every word, instinctively recognizing that they were witnessing something important. My grandmother gave this to me before I enlisted, James continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. She told me it would keep me safe, but I think she meant something different than physical safety. She meant it would remind me to stay connected to the best parts of being human, even when facing the worst parts. The attacker's hand was trembling now, though whether from emotion or uncertainty, it was impossible to tell. He tried to regain his aggressive posture, pulling once more at the chain, but his heart clearly wasn't in it anymore. James's words had created a crack in whatever armor of anger or desperation had driven him to this moment. "I don't know what brought you here today," James said, "or what pain you're carrying that made you think hurting a stranger would somehow help. But I want you to know that I forgive you, not because of my uniform or my duty, but because someone once taught me that forgiveness is the only thing that can break the cycle of pain, passing from one person to another." An elderly woman in the crowd began to cry, and several people were visibly moved by the guard's unexpected response. This was not the kind of story they had expected to witness on a casual tourist visit to Windsor Castle. They had come to see history and tradition, but instead they were watching history being made in real time. The attacker looked around at the faces surrounding him, and for the first time seemed to really see the crowd he had drawn. There were children watching with wide eyes, families who had come here for a pleasant day out, elderly couples who had probably visited this castle dozens of times over the years. His actions had disrupted all of their experiences, turning their peaceful afternoon into something ugly and frightening. James sensed the shift in the man's demeanor and pressed forward, not with aggression but with even more compassion. "Whatever you're going through, whatever has happened to you, it doesn't have to define who you are in this moment. You have the power to choose differently. My grandfather chose courage over fear. My grandmother chose love over bitterness, and right now, you can choose healing over hurt." The silver cross caught the light again as it swayed between them, and suddenly it seemed less like a prize to be won or lost and more like what it had always been, a symbol of hope, of connection across generations, of the belief that people are capable of being better than their worst moments. The attacker's face was changing, the hard mask of anger slowly dissolving to reveal something much more vulnerable underneath. The crowd held its breath, sensing that they were at a crucial turning point in this extraordinary encounter. The transformation in the attacker's face was remarkable to witness. The hard lines of anger began to soften, and his eyes, which had been filled with aggression just moments before, started to glisten with unshed tears. His grip on the silver cross loosened further, and his whole body seemed to deflate as if some internal pressure had finally been released. The man began, his voice cracking with emotion. "I lost my job 3 months ago. My wife left me, took our daughter with her. I haven't seen my little girl in weeks, and she won't even talk to me on the phone anymore." The words poured out of him like water from a broken dam, years of pain and frustration finally finding voice. James felt his own eyes moisten with sympathy. He had expected anger, violence, perhaps even mental instability, but what he was seeing now was something much more familiar and heartbreaking, a man who had reached the end of his rope and didn't know how to find his way back to hope. "I came here because I thought," the man continued, struggling to find words, "I thought if I could make someone else feel as powerless as I do, maybe it would hurt less. I know that sounds crazy, but I was just so angry at everything, at everyone who seemed to have their life together while mine was falling apart." The crowd remained completely silent, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a threatening situation had become something much more profound, a moment of raw human connection playing out in one of the most formal and traditional settings in Britain. James made a decision that would have shocked his commanding officers if they had witnessed it. Very slowly and deliberately, he stepped slightly forward, technically breaking his rigid guard position for the first time in his career. It was a small movement, barely noticeable to most observers, but it was a gesture of reaching toward another human being in need. "What's your daughter's name?" James asked gently, his voice carrying the same warmth that his grandmother had always used when comforting him during difficult times. "Emma," the man whispered, and saying her name seemed to break something inside him. Tears began flowing freely down his cheeks. "She's only 5 years old. She loves fairy tales and thinks all soldiers are heroes. She used to tell me I was her favorite hero, but now—" His voice trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "She still thinks that?" James said with complete conviction. "Children don't stop loving their parents because of difficult times. She's probably missing you just as much as you're missing her, wondering when her daddy is coming to see her again." An older gentleman in the crowd stepped forward slightly, his own eyes wet with tears. Others began moving closer too, not to interfere or gawk, but to offer silent support for what was unfolding. The situation had touched something deep in the hearts of everyone present. "I don't know how to fix any of this," the attacker said, his voice barely audible. "I've made such a mess of everything. I've hurt people, pushed away everyone who tried to help me. I came here today thinking I wanted to hurt someone else, but really I just wanted the pain to stop." James reached up very slowly and placed his hand over the man's hand that was still holding the cross. "Pain doesn't stop by passing it on to others," he said quietly. "It stops when we learn to forgive ourselves and accept help from people who care. And right now, looking at all these faces around us, I can tell you that there are people who care." The man looked around the crowd for the first time with clear eyes, and what he saw surprised him. Instead of judgment or fear, he saw compassion. People weren't backing away from him or calling for security. They were witnessing his moment of breakdown with genuine empathy and concern. "I don't deserve this kindness," he said, shaking his head. "Not after what I tried to do to you, not after the way I've been living." "Deserving has nothing to do with it," James replied. "Grace isn't something we earn. It's something we receive and then we pass it on. My grandmother taught me that every person we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about. Today I'm meeting yours." The silver cross seemed to catch more light as it hung between them, no longer a symbol of conflict but of connection. The chain was damaged but not broken, much like the man who had tried to take it and the guard who had chosen compassion over retaliation. What happened next surprised everyone, including James himself. The attacker carefully removed his hand from the silver cross and, with trembling fingers, began trying to fix the damaged chain around James's neck. His movements were gentle and respectful, a complete reversal of the violence he had shown just minutes earlier. "I'm so sorry," he whispered as he worked to repair what he had broken. "I'm so deeply sorry. This meant everything to you, and I almost destroyed it because I was destroying myself." His hands shook as he tried to mend the delicate links, his face a picture of genuine remorse and shame. James stood perfectly still, allowing this act of attempted restoration to take place. He could feel the man's tears falling onto his uniform as he worked, and the guard found himself deeply moved by this stranger's effort to undo the damage he had caused. It was more than just fixing a piece of jewelry. It was a symbolic attempt to heal the wound he had created. "There," the man said finally, stepping back to look at his work. The chain was functional again, though it bore the marks of what had happened. "It's not perfect, but it's whole." He looked up at James with red-rimmed eyes. "I wish I knew how to fix everything else I've broken as easily." An elderly woman from the crowd stepped forward, her voice gentle but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Young man," she said to the attacker, "fixing things takes time, but it starts with exactly what you just did, taking responsibility and making the effort to repair what you can." Her words seemed to open floodgates of support from the other observers. A middle-aged man in a business suit approached and said, "I work in employment services. If you're serious about getting back on your feet, I'd like to help." A woman with kind eyes added, "I run a support group for people going through difficult divorces. You don't have to face this alone." James watched in amazement as what had begun as an assault transformed into an impromptu community of care. Complete strangers were offering help, support, and resources to a man who had tried to attack him just minutes earlier. It was like witnessing the very best of human nature emerging from what could have been its worst. The man looked overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of assistance. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Why are you all being so kind to me? I came here to cause trouble, to hurt someone. I don't deserve this." "None of us deserves kindness," replied the elderly woman who had spoken first. That's what makes it grace. We give it freely because someone once gave it freely to us. She smiled warmly. Besides, dear, you're someone's father. That little girl needs her daddy to find his way back to being the hero she remembers. At the mention of his daughter, the man's composure broke again, but this time his tears seemed cleaner somehow, less desperate and more hopeful. I want to be the man she thought I was, he said. I want to be worthy of her love again. James finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of his uniform, but also the warmth of someone who had learned important lessons about compassion. You already are worthy of her love. The fact that you're standing here trying to make amends, proving that you can choose differently when it matters, that's the hero she needs to see. Security guards were finally approaching, having been alerted to the disturbance, but James held up a hand to signal that the situation was under control. The lead security officer looked confused by the scene. Instead of finding an aggressive confrontation, he discovered what looked like a support group meeting in the middle of the castle courtyard. Everything's fine here, James told the security team. Just a misunderstanding that's been resolved. He looked at the man who had attacked him. Isn't that right? The man nodded vigorously. Yes, completely resolved. And He turned to address the security guards directly. If there are consequences for what I did, I accept them. I take full responsibility for my actions. But the security officer, having observed the scene for several minutes before approaching, made a decision that surprised everyone. From what I witnessed, it looks like you've already faced the most important consequences, he said thoughtfully. Sometimes the best justice is the kind that transforms people, rather than just punishing them. The crowd murmured approval, and several people began applauding, not for entertainment, but in recognition of something beautiful they had witnessed. They had come to Windsor Castle expecting to see historical traditions, but instead they had seen something timeless and universal, the power of compassion to change hearts and heal wounds. 6 months later, James Mitchell was completing his regular patrol when he noticed a familiar figure approaching the castle gates. The man looked completely different, cleaner, healthier, with a confidence in his step that hadn't been there during their first encounter. Beside him walked a small girl with bright eyes and bouncing curls, who was practically vibrating with excitement about visiting the castle. That's him, Emma, the man said to his daughter, pointing toward James. That's the guard I told you about, the one who helped Daddy remember how to be brave. The little girl's eyes went wide with wonder as she looked up at James in his full ceremonial uniform. He's really tall, she whispered loudly, making both her father and several nearby tourists chuckle. And he has a big hat like in my storybooks. James, bound by protocol to remain motionless and silent during his guard duty, couldn't respond directly, but his eyes sparkled with warmth as he looked down at the child. And there was the slightest hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth, barely noticeable to most observers, but clear to anyone who knew to look for it. The man stepped closer to James's position and spoke quietly but clearly. I wanted to bring Emma to meet you properly, and to tell you how much that day changed my life. I got the job that gentleman offered me, and I've been attending the support group the lady mentioned. Most importantly, Emma and I have been spending weekends together again. His voice was thick with gratitude. She's been asking about the nice soldier for months. Emma tugged on her father's coat sleeve. Daddy, can I give him something? You said he was sad that day too, and that he made you feel better. Maybe this will make him feel better too. From her small backpack, the 5-year-old pulled out a drawing she had made, a colorful picture of a castle, a tall figure in a red uniform, and 2 people holding hands under a bright yellow sun. At the bottom, in careful crayon letters, she had written, "Thank you for helping my daddy come home." Her father carefully tucked the drawing into a small gap in the castle gate, where James would be able to retrieve it later, after his shift ended. She's been working on this for weeks, he explained. She wanted to make sure you knew that helping me meant helping her too. Other tourists had gathered around, sensing that something special was happening. Several recognized the man from videos of the encounter that had gone viral on social media, turning the story of the Queen's Guard's compassionate response into an international symbol of grace under pressure. Is this the guard from that video? Asked a teenager with his family. The one who talked that angry guy down instead of fighting him? That's me, the man said, no longer ashamed of the story. I was the angry guy. But this soldier, he gestured toward James, He saw past my anger to the pain underneath, and he chose kindness when he could have chosen anything else. Emma suddenly broke away from her father and walked right up to James's position. Standing directly in front of him, she looked up with the fearless curiosity that only children possess. "My daddy says you have a special necklace that keeps you safe, like a magic charm in fairy tales. Is it magic?" James couldn't speak, but he very slowly and deliberately touched his chest where his grandmother's cross lay beneath his uniform. The gesture was small but clear, and Emma's face lit up with delight. "I knew it was magic," she declared triumphantly. "All the best heroes have magic protection. That's how they stay brave when scary things happen." Her father gently guided her back to his side. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart? The real magic wasn't in the necklace. It was in choosing to be kind when someone was being mean. That's the hardest magic of all." Emma nodded solemnly, processing this grown-up wisdom with the seriousness that children bring to important lessons. "So the soldier is magic because he was nice to you when you were being mean?" "Exactly," her father said, his voice carrying profound gratitude. "He was magic because he saw the best in me even when I wasn't showing it." As the crowd began to disperse, the man lingered for one more moment. "I know you can't respond," he said to James, "but I hope you know that what you did that day didn't just save me. It saved my relationship with my daughter. She has her hero back, and it's because you reminded me how to be one." James remained at perfect attention, but there was something different in his posture, a sense of fulfillment and purpose that went beyond military duty. He had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from helping them find their way back to being friends. Later that evening, after his shift had ended, James carefully retrieved Emma's drawing from the castle gate. As he looked at her cheerful artwork and read her crayon message, he touched his grandmother's cross and whispered a quiet thank you, to Martha for her lessons in compassion, to his grandfather for his example of courage, and to a little girl who had reminded him that heroes are measured not by the battles they win, but by the lives they touch along the way. The drawing now hangs in James's apartment next to a photo of his grandmother, serving as a daily reminder that the most powerful force in the world isn't strength or tradition or protocol. It's the simple choice to respond to pain with love and to darkness with light.